So next up, we've got a very timely topic. This session is called Eyes Wide Open, and it will be focusing on the Australian current biosecurity outlook and how clients can best support, or how advisors, can best support their clients with biosecurity threat preparedness and emergency response planning. So we're very lucky today to have with us two great speakers. Speaking first will be Dr. Beth Cookson, who is the Deputy Australian Chief Veterinary Officer. And following on from her will be Rachel O'Brien, who is the Northern Director for AgForce Cattle Board. So thank you so much, Beth.
Thank you. Is there here we go. Get myself organised. Thank you for the introduction and for the opportunity to come and speak with you all today. Biosecurity has been a very topical topic for much of this year, and today I'm going to try to explain why we're concerned, what's changed in our region, particularly for Northern Australia, and there are some very particular diseases that we're focused on at the moment that's got pathways into the north that we're concerned with. Part of the creation of my role, which is based in Cairns, was to look specifically at some of these threats and to increase the presence of the Commonwealth Government in the north to feed policy input directly back into our considerations at the national level. So what I'm going to go through today is a little bit about what's the drivers of the threats, what those threats are, a little bit of a 101 about some of the diseases of concern at the moment, a bit about what we're doing, what practical advice for producers there are, because there's lots of information out there at the moment, and then Rachel is going to talk more about the on-farm biosecurity and planning aspects. I also think that the conversation is often better than the presentation, so I'm going to keep to time, and hopefully at the end we'll have plenty of time for questions. So what I want to focus on here is the changes that we've seen in the region over the last 5 years. Australia has been lucky in terms of our animal health status. We are an island, we've got very strict border controls, and that has meant that we have retained a very favourable animal health status for a long time. What we've seen over the last 5 years is the emergence in the region of significant animal health threats to Australia. We conducted an expert judgment process in March 2021, and the experts at that time estimated that in the next 5 years, the probability of an internationally notifiable incursion of a significant animal health threat was 42%. This slide is a little bit of a misleading because the fourth disease was actually African horse sickness, not avian influenza. But nonetheless, we had 42% prediction that we may see a significant disease in our country in the next 5 years. We repeated that exercise based on the change in distribution of two very significant diseases, that being lumpy skin disease, that was detected for the first time in Indonesia in March this year, and foot and mouth disease, as you would, be all aware, was detected in Indonesia for the first time in over 30 years in May this year. And that probability, based on our expert updates of those two diseases arriving in the next 5 years, was up to 56%. So we are facing significant threats at our border. It's not all doom and gloom. We have very good border processes in place, and we've got very good preparedness. But I think in terms of raising the awareness of the significant pressure and what's actually changed in the region, it's important to know that the regional biosecurity situation has actually reached a point of instability. Some of the drivers for those changes in the region, African swine fever was detected in 2018 in Asia and spread rapidly through China and then into Southeast Asia. It's now present in Indonesia, Timor-Leste and Papua New Guinea. Lumpy skin disease, which hadn't been detected outside of African countries until very recently, has emerged in the region. It was detected in China in 2019 and has continued to spread in Southeast Asia with the most recent introduction into Indonesia, as I mentioned. And foot and mouth disease, which has always been present, but at the moment several countries are experiencing unprecedented outbreaks, and as I mentioned, Indonesia for the first time in 2022, for the first time in 30 odd years. When we looked at those expert elicitation processes, and I'm explaining this because I'm going to talk about pathways in a minute, and it's important to understand some of the differences between these diseases. Because of the nature of the diseases, our experts predicted that lumpy skin disease had increased from 8% probability in the next 5 years to 28% because of its presence in Indonesia. Whereas for foot and mouth disease, which is quite a different disease, our experts had updated the estimate from 9% to 11.6%. And there's some really important reasons why the pathways are quite different between these diseases. Quickly, why are we seeing the emergence of new animal diseases in our region? We've had food security issues, so we're seeing increased amount of trade and movement within the region. We've got some climatic factors at play. So the season that we've just had over the last couple of years, you probably would have all have heard about Japanese encephalitis. So we're seeing some climate sensitive diseases start to emerge and have a different profile in the region. And also COVID. COVID has really weakened our systems globally. So our capacity to detect and to respond, and also to maintain our vigilance, and I'm talking regional, not Australian at this point, but within the region, those systems have really been weakened. So we have seen a lot of disease movement throughout the immediate region over the last few years. Avian influenza, I'm not going to spend too much time on that. I know it's not probably of as much interest, but again, it's one of those diseases that we're watching very carefully at the moment. Is in the Northern Hemisphere. They have sustained outbreaks that they haven't experienced before for over 12 months now. Our risk season is from September to November. We don't traditionally see a lot of interplay between the strains that they have in the Northern Hemisphere and Australia, but because of the level and the type of outbreak they're experiencing at the moment, as we have migratory birds, it is one of those threats that we're also looking out for at the moment. So I mentioned pathways, and I just want to, I'm going to go into the diseases in a couple of slides, but just to bear in mind that the main pathways of concern into Australia for probably the two most significant diseases that we're worried about, foot and mouth disease, import of contaminated products. So that's really important. The virus for foot and mouth disease can be sustained in cured products, uncooked meat products, for quite a long period of time, and that is the main pathway that we're concerned with the introduction of foot and mouth disease into Australia. Of course, and there's been plenty of media about this at the moment, with the disease having been confirmed in Bali just recently, there is a risk that contaminated clothing, vehicles and equipment is a pathway as well. The virus can be sustained on inanimate objects for quite a long time as well. Mostly that's associated with exposure to heavily infected animals and the excretions, mucus, manure, urine, saliva, that type of thing. For lumpy skin disease, the primary concern that we're worried about is the wind-borne insects. Quite a different disease with the mechanical transmission between animals caused by a variety of different insects, including biting flies, so your stable flies, your march flies, your tabanids, some evidence of mosquitoes being involved in that transmission cycle, and some evidence of the biting midge, which is the culicoides associated with our blue tongue transmission in Australia, also being a potential vector. But quite an important difference with blue tongue, because for lumpy skin disease, it's mechanical only. So it's not a biological part of the insect. But nonetheless, we are worried that if lumpy skin disease continues to spread throughout Indonesia, particularly into the eastern parts, that there may be a pathway based on cyclonic activity in particular into the north. We're also conscious of the risk from returning livestock vessels and returning planes. Again, that's as a conveyance for infected insects rather than virus particles. And contaminated products play a much sort of less role for lumpy skin disease as they do for foot and mouth disease. Though the virus can stay, I'm not sure what's happened there, can be sustained in the hide and skin and the scabs that fall off the animals as they're recovering. So just in terms of consequences, obviously for Australian livestock, both of these diseases have significant animal health and welfare concerns. They cause production losses, and we also, and importantly, lose international trade based on the presence of these diseases. Australia is recognised as free from both lumpy skin disease and foot and mouth disease at the current point in time, and those impacts can be quite long lasting whilst the return to freedom, so eradication, control, and then looking to return to freedom. And they can be unpredictable. So it's based on trading partners and the protocols that are in place to support the trade in animals and animal products. And whilst you can work towards returning to a free status, the recognition of that is based on a bilateral negotiation between trading partners. So a lot of it's dependent on the need in country, their own animal health status, and the reliance on our supplies. You may have seen that the estimated economic impacts for foot and mouth disease has been estimated at $80 billion over 10 years. So very, very substantial impacts to our economy. So foot and mouth disease, it's a viral disease, highly infectious. So it transmits by direct contact between animals very, very rapidly. And what you see with foot and mouth disease is, as it's described, these blisters in the mouth, around the nose areas, and above the hooves in the coronary band. It affects all cloven hooved animals, and so that's cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and deer. The signs of foot and mouth disease that you'll typically see is production loss, so particularly in dairy cattle, you'll see an immediate drop in milk yield. You will also then go on to see the secondary effects of the painful lesions in the mouth and feet. So you'll see animals that are drooling, they're reluctant to eat, they might be laying down and quite lame. And probably important to remember for foot and mouth disease that there's quite a difference in the host range and how they express the disease. So you'll see more significant disease in cattle. Sheep and goats, you often don't see much disease at all. It can be quite mild. And in the UK experience, sheep and goats were actually involved in the widespread transmission of foot and mouth disease before it was picked up, because people just didn't realise that the mild lameness they were seeing was caused by foot and mouth disease. Lumpy skin disease, it's a pox virus. This is the one that's spread by the biting insects predominantly. Small amount of transmission through direct contact can occur, but predominantly it's the spread through the biting insects. You see the typical pox lesions, and they will be full thickness through the skin. Important, I think, for people to remember that other conditions in Australia can look quite similar. So buffalo fly, for example. And so part of our messaging is early detection is key for both these diseases. So there is emergency animal disease reporting mechanisms, and it's better to be on the safe side than to just assume it's what you've come to think of as a normal condition. Some difference in breed susceptibility for this one. So you'll find that in the Bos indicus, the Indian northern breeds, you may see less signs than you will see in the Bos taurus types of breeds. And again, not only the trade impacts, you do get production losses for these for this disease as well, and obviously the damage to the hide also causes economic loss as well. This one is limited to infecting cattle and buffalo, so it doesn't have the wide host range that foot and mouth disease does. I'm not going to talk about avian influenza and African swine fever today, just in the interest of time. But I do want to just talk a little bit about what we've seen in Indonesia, just to put a bit of a scale on the current outbreak. So I mentioned it was detected in, foot and mouth disease was detected in Indonesia in May. It had probably been present there since April. I think that's when the first cases were reported. It was reported in Sumatra. Let me see if I can work this. So it was maybe not. It was reported in Sumatra initially, and also the island of Java, so in 2 provinces. The most recent update of case numbers that we've had is over 300,000 animals impacted across all of Sumatra, all of Java. It's reached Kalimantan, it reached Lombok, and last week was confirmed in cattle in Bali. The response in Indonesia consisted initially of trying to sustain movement controls, but they were in the middle of peak festival season, which makes those controls very hard to ensure compliance with. And it took quite a long time for vaccines to reach Indonesia. They have now commenced a vaccination program. There's 3 million doses, I believe, in country, and Australia's working with Indonesia to provide access to additional vaccines and also technical expert. So our work abroad is really to try to help our Indonesian partners manage the disease at source and reduce the threat level to Australia. So that's the first approach. I also mentioned our biosecurity at the border. So this is really important for people who are travelling overseas, potentially working with livestock and coming back into Australia, in terms of managing the risk of potentially for contaminated product coming back in. Those contaminated product can't legally be brought back in, but we do know through incoming passenger declarations that people who don't know or inadvertently bring it in, sometimes deliberately bring in pork products or other jerkies and that type of thing, is a pathway that we have a very strong focus on at the border. And also through mail pathways and cargo pathways. I think, the other thing that's happened as a result of COVID is there's a lot more international movement and incoming mail in particular. Livestock vessels, I've mentioned before with lumpy skin disease. Again, strict biosecurity protocols about how those vessels are managed when they come back into Australia. The awareness of the public is a really strong focus for us at the moment. So as much as there's a lot of negative media attention, I think the best we can all do is to raise the profile, the factual information about these diseases and increase the awareness at the ground level for both management of travellers as they come through the pathway, but also on-farm biosecurity and practices at the local level. We We've also got strong preparedness activities in place for foot and mouth disease. So I think that's also really important to understand. So we've done a lot of work over decades for foot and mouth disease. It's been the number one disease of concern to Australia for a long time. We've got good response strategies in place. We've got a foot and mouth disease vaccine bank, which is held in the UK. So there's immediate access to vaccines should we need them here, and well-practiced response strategies. For lumpy skin disease, it's a bit of a different focus for us for lumpy skin disease. To date, it has been contained in Indonesia to the island of Sumatra, where it was initially detected. I say that with a little bit of caution, I guess, because since foot and mouth disease has hit Indonesia, their resources and attention have naturally been diverted to foot and mouth disease. So we're not getting a lot of current reporting around the lumpy skin disease situation, but certainly what we've heard is that whilst there's been some suspected cases outside of Sumatra, they haven't been confirmed to be lumpy skin disease. That's good news for us, because as I mentioned, the wind-borne pathway is the main pathway of concern, and certainly from what we know about our experience with blue tongue and other diseases, it's the more eastern parts of Indonesia, it's Timor-Leste, it's Papua New Guinea, where those pathways are active. So again, our strategy has been to help Indonesia to contain the spread of the disease. We have already provided Indonesia with support to purchase vaccines, and also offered technical expertise for their lumpy skin disease response. Unfortunately, the systems in place for Indonesia to be able to vaccinate are very limited. So they've got about 90% of the livestock herd is held by smallholders, and they're often free roaming. So the ability to corral, to vaccinate, to maintain a cold chain, to ensure the viability of those vaccines has been a real challenge, and will continue to challenge Indonesia. Australia, because lumpy skin disease had typically been a disease of the Africas, until 2019, when it was detected in China, we hadn't put the same level of effort into preparedness for lumpy skin disease as we had for foot and mouth disease. Our national plan has a number of strategies that could be employed, including vaccination, but we don't have a registered vaccine that we could deploy quickly. So one of the things that we're doing quite rapidly is going through the process to get emergency use permits in place. So should we have to respond to lumpy skin disease, that we're able to do that. And vaccination overseas has been a key part of the success of response strategies. So I'm just having a quick look at the time. And so I won't spend too much focus on this. The Lumpy Skin Disease National Action Plan has been developed, as I said, because there's plenty of things that we need to do to improve our preparedness for lumpy skin disease. And it's been really, I guess, pleasing to see how industry and how governments across all levels have come together to not only identify the gaps but start to work on the solutions to those. Quick plug for traceability, key part of any response. I think Rachel's going to talk more about that, so I'll not. So key messages that we've been trying to get out there. The more people know about these diseases, how to recognise them, how to report them, the better. Our response is really very reliant on being able to detect and respond quickly should they arrive here. And in terms of those messages for travellers that may be working in overseas countries, we do deal with travellers coming from foot and mouth disease affected countries on a daily basis. Indonesia may be experiencing an outbreak at the moment, but India, Nepal, China, parts of Malaysia, Vietnam, these are all FMD endemic countries, and our biosecurity system is very well geared up to identify the product and any other risk materials. But with the outbreak situation, there has been a very big focus on ramping up the efforts around flights arriving from Indonesia at this particular point in time. So what we're sort of saying to travellers, incoming passenger declarations are really important. It helps the biosecurity officers target the right people. We've also got profiling in place, so against cohorts and individuals. So we've got quite sophisticated profiling tools now that are automatically, or through the analysis of those behaviours and what we know about how people comply, can target specific individuals and cohorts coming through. And advising people to take basic biosecurity precautions, make sure clothes are clean, boots are clean when you're coming back in, and maintaining those sort of strict protocols. From a producer level, we're also encouraging people to have, make sure their on-farm biosecurity is really well up to date, and also just to be conscious about where people are coming from, particularly if you've got overseas workers coming onto properties. Good idea regardless of the situation, but particularly at the moment, not to have people coming directly from overseas onto properties. I might leave it there.
And we'll do questions after Rachel's speech.
Thanks, Beth. It's always pretty difficult, I think, to get up in front of people after Beth, because she's just got a wealth of knowledge. So I was already a little bit nervous about speaking to a room of advisors when I don't really feel like I've made it as advisor myself. But, it is really nice to be here, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to come and talk to you about what is my passion, which is biosecurity, particularly around biosecurity communications for livestock industries. I've been in the biosecurity space for about 10 years now, and I really specialise in specific messaging to livestock industries, particularly cattle. I'm just going to probably, enhance Beth's presentation a little bit, just around what we do as a country to make sure that we are prepared for all biosecurity threats. So we've just heard about the current situation, foot and mouth and lumpy skin disease being the front and centre. Really big news headlines at the moment, and I'm going to go into a little bit of that. But to give you some context, I wanted to explain what our Australian biosecurity system looks like. So this is her in all of her beauty. The Australian biosecurity system is made up of both post-border biosecurity and then pre-border biosecurity. So our pre-border biosecurity is what Beth has just alluded to. So we've got that whole natural biosecurity. We have a very big geographical advantage to other countries because we don't share borders. We have trade protocols that make sure that what we are bringing into this country remains safe. We have legislation that supports those entries and penalties for people that breach it. We have preventative measures, and those preventative measures include that surveillance. So we're actively looking for threats quite frequently. We do that through partnerships, but at the border there are surveillance programs that are always looking for what is our next biggest concern. So we do have a very strong pre-border biosecurity system, and it's worth noting that it has stood up to the test of foot and mouth for the last 120 years. But if something does happen to get through to the keeper, it's always best to hedge your bets. So we also have a post-border biosecurity system, which this is where we're trying to find something quickly. This is what this system does. So as Beth said, we do have a traceability system. I know we get criticised a lot for our NLS system, but it is pretty good. From a government perspective, the system gives government people the ability to trace. Okay, we can trace livestock with very high percentages within 24 hours, providing that the information's in the system. So to put that into context for you, that is so much easier than what other countries have. When I went over to Nepal for the EU FMD course, we were chasing goat traders through Nepal there. with no traceability whatsoever. There was no movement records and there was no NLS system. So I came back just thinking to myself, like, thank God we've got that, because that is one huge tool that we have at our disposal. It's on a computer. You're not chasing people for hard copy records. So it is a massive advantage, and we pin a lot of what we say and a lot of what we sell on the fact that we have that. We have market access programs. So whilst we're conducting surveillance, we do still conduct, sorry, I should have started with surveillance then. We do conduct surveillance for disease. So through both active and passive surveillance systems. So we are actively looking for things that we know we don't have. And then we are then passively, for those producers that report disease, we go out, test that type of call out, and make sure that is not something that is exotic. We then use that type of information in those market access programs, and we use that to then bolster our international trade. So we're always demonstrating to our trade partners that we don't have the diseases that we're saying that we're free of. And the other aspects of market access programs that we have at a national level are underpinned by our legislation. And they are around ensuring that high-risk pathways don't compromise our biosecurity systems. So ruminant feed ban program, for instance, making sure that restricted animal material doesn't make its way into ruminants. And then also, obviously, a ban on soil feeding for pigs, which has been banned since 1996. As Beth just said, that's a really high-risk pathway for FMD, so we have that secondary precaution to make sure that if something does get through that system, then we've got another safeguard. And then the big one is on-farm biosecurity plans, which is what I'm going to talk to you a little bit later on. So what we've seen in the last week is we've really seen that elevation of the biosecurity system. A good biosecurity system should flex to the challenge, okay? It's always going to rise and meet those new threats and challenges. So I'm not going to go into too much detail because Beth already has, but we have made significant investments into biosecurity preparedness. And through my role as AgForce Cattle Board, biosecurity sits within my portfolio. So I guess we've been the muscle on the ground at this point. We have been sitting in a lot of these task forces and on these partnerships, making sure that the industry is represented. We are off to Canberra next week for both the Lumpy Skin Disease National Action Plan and also to tidy up and finalise the AusVet plan for FMD as well. So we are actively engaged in the conversation, and there is a lot of conversation going on at the moment. Our main goal right now is to really help our trusted trade partner in securing their food supply. Okay, that is something that Indonesia in particular are dealing with right now, and they are a very valued trade partner to Australia. So we are fundamentally behind them and trying to help them as much as we can through our federal government. There is a huge amount of collaboration across federal, state and industry. And there's plenty of communication material coming out. I think we're to a point where it's almost saturated and people just don't really know where to look. So I'm going to point you to some, I guess, reputable sources. So our post-border biosecurity system, which I've probably already touched on, this is where I guess our on-farm biosecurity plans can really start to step up and support our post-border biosecurity system. So producers are a wealth of knowledge and they are your clients. So what we are asking you as advisors to do is to make sure that you are taking reputable information to them. And as Beth has said, knowing the symptoms of FMD and also knowing where to report are two really critical messages that we are trying to get through to producers. So again, it's the fail-safe. If it gets in, we want to be able to identify it, contain it and eradicate it as quickly as we can. Then we get back into our proof of freedom, get our trade markets back. So there are some really, I guess, high-level messaging for producers at this point. It really is about getting your biosecurity plan up to date, making sure that you're looking at your risks that are actually individual to your business and then taking those steps to reduce it. And also animal health programs, so managing disease through preventative programs, which we've touched on today as well, so vaccinations. Because if you've got happy and healthy animals, they're not immune compromised. So it means that they're not going to be as susceptible to disease. So this is probably where it gets a bit complicated. So we have some biosecurity fundamentals that you really do need to stick to. Otherwise, it can become ineffective biosecurity. So biosecurity is not static, and therefore neither is biosecurity planning. It's not a do it once and then never look at it again, because your risk profile is always changing. So Beth just said, last 5 years, the risk profile has changed dramatically to Australia. It's exactly the same with people who are in business in livestock. This is the one that I've always really struggled with. If you do everything right, nothing happens, and therefore biosecurity is undervalued by most producers. It's an insurance policy. If you're doing everything right, you shouldn't have a disease incursion. So that's always been a real challenge, because then they get complacent. I think we all get complacent. And then there are the different levels of biosecurity that must be adjusted to suit the threat to be effective. So I like to call these peacetime biosecurity, where we're just managing run-of-the-mill things that we deal with every day. And then we have emergency animal disease biosecurity response planning, which is when we've hit that emergency button and we actually need to elevate our own biosecurity to address a threat that is very real and imminent. So this is probably for our post-border biosecurity system. This is actually the fundamental one. Successful eradication requires timely detection. It is so important. We do have some challenges in North Australia because we are not necessarily out looking at livestock every single day. So it's more than likely that something may be bubbling away for some time before we get our actual eyes on it. So it's really important that we have processes in place to be looking at livestock and managing their health. So this one, I just wanted to try and put this into a visual context for you. This is around knowing the threats that you're addressing to be accurate. Okay, so on the left here, we've got an incomplete pie. You can see the host, pathway, and pathogen. Though, like your fire pyramid, this is an incursion pie. So you need those three to connect in some way to actually have a significant issue. So in the context of what we're talking around FMD, in Australia we don't have the pathogen. Okay, so we are free of FMD, it's not in Australia. And our pathways for that to occur are minimum. So because of the fact that we don't have that pathogen. So it's not likely that we're going to have an incursion of FMD unless something changes to the red one over the top, meaning that we end up with a pathogen in Australia, we have a pathway into that animal, and then we have a host that is able to become infected. So we can contextualise that from, and we are very lucky in Australia not to have a majority of those pathogens that are quite serious. We do have some endemics, and this is what you will see when you've got a crash, say, with a disease that you're going to vaccinate against. So you can see them in the endemics as well, and that's one of those reduction pathways as well. So to put it into some context, for something that is endemic and something that you can actually do something about. When I was talking about making sure that we've got health systems in place, it is around that vaccinating. So you've got a susceptible host and you've possibly got a pathogen, clostridials for instance, that may be in the soil, but if you take that pathway away because you vaccinated them against it, then they're not going to get it and you're not going to have an incursion. So there are plenty of biosecurity processes that we can put in place at an on-farm level to make sure that we are protecting ourselves as much as we can. But you really do need to know what the threat or challenge that you're facing to be accurate. So you really do need to understand what that pathway vector or practice really is, and whether or not you've got a pathogen that's present and how susceptible your host is. So it does get a bit complicated. So I guess for you guys as advisors, you're not biosecurity experts. I don't even call myself that, having been in the industry for as long as I have. But there are some simple messages that you can be conveying, and that is to be alert but not alarmed. So right now there is a significant amount of angst out there in industry. I've been fielding calls all week, particularly from producers who are talking about wanting to sell their businesses because they think they've got foot and mouth at the doorstep. That's really concerning for me. I don't want to receive calls and have to talk to producers who are just terrified. So we want to try and bring that level of anxiety down. We're not downplaying the consequence to the industry. The consequences are really high, but we have to be practical. And when we're talking biosecurity, we need to make sure that we are making smart investments and that we're investing in those margins of biosecurity so that we're having the best bang for buck. So for you guys, what we're asking you to do is to relay official messages. We are all working with this. People that are out in the media saying nothing is being done, they're not involved in the conversations. There is significant amount of work being completed to prepare Australia, but also to prevent it. Preventative is always the best response, and that is definitely where our focus is on. We do want you to utilise resources on the DAF eHub and also releases from the Australian government. Okay, they are factual and they've been checked. So we want to start pushing out those information. We want you to keep up to date as much as you can. And we want you to support producers to understand risk. So it is really complex, but the risk right now of someone walking from Bali into Australia and causing an FMD outbreak on their shoes is very low. We don't want to see live animals in Australia, which we don't have, and we don't want, I guess, infected materials or product coming into the country, because that's where the risk starts to heighten. So as Beth has said, if you are talking to producers who are talking about travel, it's not about them not travelling, it's just about making sure that they are not connecting the dots between livestock overseas and also in Australia. So there needs to be a period of exclusion, up to 7 days, laundering clothes and washing footwear as well. The challenge that we have with FMD being a hardier little virus is that the controls that we need to apply to it are quite high, but just reducing the soil content on the base of your shoes will address a significant amount of risk. There's also probably one of the bigger biosecurity fundamentals is also segregation. So if you can't actually manage the risk, just separate it. If you're never connecting, okay, didn't work very well. If you're never connecting that pie graph, you're not going to have an incursion. So we need to be really clear that even if someone walked a virus particle into Australia on their shoe, that is not an incursion of foot and mouth. Thank you. And the big thing for us as well is currently encouraging producers to update their plan. So we want them to be prepared. In the context of their plans, they can be asking visitors where they've been. Just something so simple about having a conversation. If they've been to an FMD infected country, ask them that they are taking precautions and possibly delaying their visit for 7 days before they get there. Try and limit their contact with livestock as well. Again, it's about breaking that pathway between overseas livestock and Australian livestock. So here are some of the resources, and I'm probably not technical enough to be able to click on the links that I embedded because I imagine it's going to go somewhere else. I'm not going to be able to find it. But there are significant resources available. The Australian government, the biosecurity site, has quite a lot of information. There is a really handy foot and mouth page as well that really steps out some of those concerns that livestock producers are having. The eHub has specific information about FMD and lumpy skin disease. The Farm Biosecurity site has biosecurity plan templates on them, specific for extensive livestock industries, which is the property biosecurity management plan there as well. They work on a risk matrix, which is the table up the top there. So it's really about you stepping through biosecurity planning with your clients so that they understand what is the consequence to them and what is their current risk, what are the steps that they can take to reduce that risk to bring that down to an acceptable level for them.